Let's consider a little bit of history about Libya. First of all, when the Greeks came to this country, this coastal region, North Africa, called Libya, it was called Pentapolis. When the Romans settled there after the Greeks, they called it Cyrenaica. And when the Islamic Arabs came into North Africa, they renamed it Barca. But it's still Libya. And Libya has some interesting ruins that are fun to roam around in, discover all kinds of things. But one of the most interesting ones to me was just outside of Benghazi. It's kind of, I think, south of the airport there, Benina Airport, was a deep cut in the rock, and it was called the Grotto of Lethe. And there wasn't really much to identify it except that there was a fence, kind of barbed wire type fence, all the way around this big hole in the earth. And one day I stopped, the driver took me over, and I stopped and looked down in there. And a couple things I noticed. One was it was deep and it was dark down there. And there was a lot of vegetation growing on the walls of the sides of this deep canyon that was cut in the rock. But down at the bottom was a big cast iron gate. So it was obvious that the cavern down there was being closed off. Nobody was allowed to get into it. But I also noticed that there were electric lines coming from the surface down the side walls of this canyon down into that point where the gate was. And those electric wires went into the cavern beyond it, this grotto. So I asked a lot of questions, and turned out that this is the mythical Grotto of Lethe. Lethe was one of the 5 rivers that the Greeks used in mythology for people who entered into Hades. And this was the purported entrance to the river Lethe. I'd like to talk a little bit about that in a second. But why are there electric wires going down into that grotto? Why is there a cast iron gate preventing people from getting in? Well, it turns out when the Italians colonized Libya, that this was a nightclub. It was a grotto. It was a nightclub. And they had steps leading down to the entrance. They had electric lights inside. I guess you could go down there for drinks and dancing and what have you. It was a very popular spot for those Italian folks that lived in the Benghazi area. But what about the Grotto of Lethe? Well, it turns out there were 5 rivers that had to do with Hades. Hades was the place of death. After you died, you went to Hades. There was the river Styx. Now, each of these 5 have to do with feelings. The river Styx was the river of hatred. There was the Acheron, the river of pain. There was the Cocytus, the river of wailing. And then there was the Phlegethon, the river of fire. And Lethe was the river of forgetfulness. So it appears that in Greek mythology, because they believed in a form of reincarnation, you go through cycles of life and then you could come back from death to life and so on, that if you drank from the river Lethe, you could forget your past. Now, some might want to hang on to their past if they were considered a hero, like Odysseus or some of those guys. But others might want to forget their past, and so they would drink of the river. When the souls of the dead passed into the afterlife, they had to drink from the river in order to forget their past life and be ready for reincarnation. So the Grotto of Lethe is purportedly the entrance point to the river Lethe, where you could drink from the waters of forgetfulness in order to be ready for their perceived concept of reincarnation. Well, do we want to forget our past? Well, there's probably some things in all of our pasts we'd like to forget. But on the other hand, our past has a lot of meaning to it, to each one of us, doesn't it? And So the Greeks had a concept of how to deal with death, and I thought it was interesting that Libya was the place where you could get to the river Lethe. It turns out there are other people, like in Spain, who claim to have the entrance to the river Lethe. It's mythology, so there probably really isn't a river Lethe. But it is interesting how mythology can influence a whole culture. Thanks.